You're listening to the Hour of History podcast with your host Stephen Ballman and producer James Orble. Your Hour of History begins right now.
Welcome to the Hour of History podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman.
And I'm your producer, James Orble.
All right, great. It's good to be with you, James, and I'm excited about getting this podcast on the road. I've wanted to do a podcast for a very long time because I think now is a time where history is very important. And I think people are looking for the past, and people are looking for ways to interpret the past and how to understand the past. And I'm hoping to use this podcast as a platform, not just for anyone who's interested, although you're invited too, but for the many, many students I have and for the classes that I teach as a way for students to access materials that they might not be able to get in text or in video format. They can have it in audio, we can turn the classroom upside down, and then we can use class time for actual discussions and debate and writing, the things that really make history fun. Just today,
Cool.
I was, yeah.
Hey, how about for our listeners, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and where you come from? And
Yeah. That is a good idea. How rude of me not to introduce myself. I'm currently a PhD student at Temple University. But Philadelphia is not my original hometown. I come from California via Louisiana, New York, Korea, China. I've been to a lot of places, and throughout I've always had an appreciation for the history and the stories that make up the place. So through college, I got my undergrad degree in history. I got a master's in history and a master's in education. And now I'm going for the doctorate and trying to expand the ways in which we spread historical knowledge to people.
And what gave you the idea to do the podcast?
Well, I personally listen to a lot of podcasts myself, and I think it's a great way for people who don't have a lot of time or want to have a voice in the background or just need another way to access knowledge other than the written word. The podcast is an extraordinary opportunity for that, and it's something that we have now that can be accessed all over the world. And plus, it's like the blog of today. Everyone's starting one.
Yeah, I think it is it's a fun way for people to kind of to learn something new, and especially on the go. I think that there's lots of times where your hands are busy, you're in the car or you're kind of out doing something, but you can plug some headphones in your ears and learn something while you're on the go. So I think it's a cool opportunity.
That's exactly right, James. And one of the biggest things, and I teach at community colleges, one of the biggest things with these community college students is that they're really eager to learn and they want to get their degree done. But many of them are commuting long distances, working 2 jobs, doing tons of work that takes time where they can't be sitting with a book, with a notebook, taking notes on the literature that they read. Now, they might be on a train, they might be able to listen for 30 minutes, or they might be in a car, in a commute, and just, it's another way to sort of get the knowledge out there, and I'm really excited about it, actually.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, let me just mention a few things about myself. I'm just kind of here to help you do your thing. And so for the listeners, I'll just be kind of chiming in and getting you to maybe explain some things in some more plain language. I'm not a history buff by any means, and but I'm just I like the idea of the podcast and love chatting with you. So that'll be my place. So every once in a while, listeners, you'll hear me chime in and ask questions or throw my 2 cents in about something, and I'm also here to learn. So what do we got going today? What's on the menu?
Well, we've got a lot on the menu, but first I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention one kind of extraordinary factor about this podcast that really illustrates how neat an opportunity is, and that's where you and I are. I'm in Highland Park, New Jersey right now.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm in Hue, Vietnam. So I'm in central Vietnam, where I live here with my wife and my 2 kids. And maybe we should mention kind of how we met too. We were both studying abroad in Korea back in 2009 and 2010. And we were kind of studying similar things, and we had similar interests, and we were both from California. And so that kind of led us to meet each other and kind of learn together and experience Korea together, and we've just kind of been kept in touch and been friends since then.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a fantastic example of the sort of cross-cultural connections that really make history what it is, and that we're going to be talking about quite often on the show. So, with that said, we've got an exciting show for you here today. This is thematically appropriate as we are just now 11 days away from St. Patrick's Day. This podcast is entitled Beer into Water. It is sort of a symbolic of the deconstruction we're going to do, both the deconstruction just for understanding and for curiosity's sake about St. Patrick. So St. Patrick begins his confession, one of only 2 documents we have from the actual St. Patrick. He begins, "I am Patrick, a sinner and a very unsophisticated man. I am the least of all the faithful, and to many the most despised." Now, that's just a very short first opening line of one of, like I said, 2 documents that we have of this St. Patrick, who's about to be commemorated in a great way, in a great celebration, really in a celebration that's grown to be all over the world. So the sort of thematic guiding question, and historians always have questions, the guiding question we're going to have today is who is St. Patrick? And why does he get a day? Not a lot of people get days, whether it is for secular or religious holidays. The Catholic Church has a great tradition of honoring saints on saint days, but I don't know anyone who goes out into the streets and drinks green beer on St. Stephen's Day. But St. Patrick's Day has this cultural celebration that has made it grow into a massive event. And I want to understand who is St. Patrick and why does he get a day. So knowing questions that you want to ask and not just knowing about the past, this is exactly what historians are. So a lot of people have the misconception from school or from textbooks that historians are just people who memorize dates and memorize events. Well, that's not how it starts. What happens is a historian might come across a day like St. Patrick's Day and ask questions. It's really about curiosity. So throughout this show, I want you to be curious. James and I are always welcoming questions and concerns you have. And so if you hear something that's wrong, if you hear something that doesn't make sense, or if you're just curious to learn more, please feel free to ask us.
Yeah, I want to just quickly mention our current website, which should be accessible at least for the kind of near future. That's it's Huedroid. That's HUEDROID.com/Hour of History. And we don't have one up yet, but check back soon and we'll have a feedback section that'll be accessible from the homepage. And you can go on there and shoot us questions or make comments or anything else you want to let us know about.
Great. And so back to our guiding question, we're going to try to figure out who is St. Patrick and why does he get his day. So now the framework to understand any historical question is important. How do you approach your historical question? And I've borrowed a framework from Professor Howard Spodek at Temple University, a professor who's worked with Philadelphia city schools, with high schools, with college level. He's taught for many years. He breaks it down into 3 things. He starts with what do we already know? Then he moves to how do we know it? And last, we have a discussion. What difference does it make? Why is what we know important? Now, if you're journalistic in your background, you might recognize this as the who, what, where, when, why. But it's more simple. What do we know? How do we know it? What difference does it make? So what do we know about Patrick? He starts his confession with this very, I am a sinner. Something you might expect from someone back where Patrick was from. So let's give you the information. Patrick is born in 387. The traditional dates given are 387 to 461. Now, 5th century, any 5th century history becomes very challenging because there's not a huge amount of sources surviving. First of all, the document has to survive until now. Secondly, it has to be preserved and it has to be understood. So there's a lot of challenges. In the case of Patrick, he wrote down 2 documents. He wrote down a confession, the one I started the story with, and a letter to soldiers in Britain. Now, why would Patrick write letters to soldiers in Britain? It goes back to where Patrick comes from. And now this is a great one that will stump anyone at the bar you go to on St. Patrick's Day. Ask them, where is St. Patrick from? Aha! Some of you say, oh, Stephen, come on. I already knew that. St. Patrick's not from Ireland. But not a lot of people really know that.
He isn't?
There you go. I already... Yeah, and
you got one.
It didn't earn me a Guinness tonight, but it just might on March 17th. So, Patrick is born Patricius. He's born in the far outer ranges of the Roman Empire. Now, by the 5th century, the Roman Empire was a Christian empire, and Patrick was born to a deacon in what is now, today, known as the United Kingdom, but was then just the Britannia. The language Patrick writes in is a very vulgar Latin. He writes almost as if someone who would speak Latin but maybe have to learn it as a second language, because he was a Roman citizen. So Patrick is born. He's born in a colony of Rome. He's Christian. He's religious. His father is religious, and so he has this passed down to him. But before he can become an adult, he's kidnapped. As the story goes, he's kidnapped by pirates, and he's taken across the Irish Sea. He's taken to what we now know as Ireland today, and he becomes a slave. He's sold into slavery. Now, according to the story, Patrick is living his life as a slave. This is 5th century Ireland, so you really have to put yourself in that situation. There's not a whole lot happening. There's different pockets of different tribes, warlords. The religion is Druidism. We don't know too much other than that, but Patrick's in a place where he likely doesn't speak the language, where he's forced to do labor, and he has a lot of time to pray. So Patrick begins to get these visions, and in one of the visions, he's told that he needs to escape. So the story goes, he walks 200 miles across the distance of Ireland, and he finds a return back to Britain. Now, his story doesn't end after he returns, because Patrick is a pious, good, like you might expect, 5th century Roman citizen of a privileged background to be. So he joins the priesthood, and he finds his mission is to return to Ireland and to convert the native population to the Christianity that he grew up believing. So Patrick goes back to Ireland, and he begins to convert people, and these are all pieces of information we know from the 2 documents that Patrick left us with.
I noticed at least a couple points there you were saying as the story goes. Is that some of this kind of how much of this is kind of assumed to be folklore and how much of it is kind of assumed to be accurate?
Right. So it's a really interesting. Now, Patrick, he's at the very far out reaches of the Roman Empire. Now, we have a lot of documents from the top level Romans around the 5th century. We don't have anything, almost anything, from Britain, except for Patrick's letters. So very few documents have survived, and over time, what happens is the story grows. There's one famous historian even has a theory that there were 2 Patricks. One was Patricus and one was Palladius. So there's a whole lot of area for speculation. In fact, the problem with these ancient sources is you don't necessarily have to footnote them or reference them to bolster up your imagination. You sort of create your own justification for why things happen. So more and more people start writing about Patrick as time goes on. There's very famous documents around the 7th century, 8th century, and so on. And then all the way up to the 19th and 20th century, it eventually becomes its own study, like Patrickology, to find out what happened and what didn't. So historians have had these questions for a long time. But the only things that we can focus on really as evidence are his 2 letters.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was wondering, just because a story this old and this colorful, I'm kind of wondering how much has been inserted into the story of St. Patrick.
Right,
over time.
And not only inserted, but also interpreted. So we're talking about a Latin that is not the standard Latin that even a medievalist historian would learn, but a Latin that is spoken by a region of the Roman Empire that is quite far from Rome itself. So, almost its own dialect. So let me read you a little passage here, just so you can get a taste of the confession of what historians work with. So now this has been translated from Latin to English, and another thing we'll do is include the source material on the website, so you can look that up. So he writes, 3 days later we landed on the coast, and wandered through an empty region for 28 days. They had no food and were starving. So the next day the captain said to me, "Christian, what do you have to say? You claim your God is great and all-powerful. Why then are you unable to pray for us? We are worn down by hunger, and it's not likely we will ever see living souls again." But confidently, I, Patrick is writing, said to them, "Turn your hearts to faith, to the Lord my God, for nothing is impossible to him. For his abundance, he may send food to you this very day on your journey, that you will be satisfied." And with God's help, that's exactly what happened. Suddenly, a herd of pigs appeared before us on the road. They killed many of them, and their hunger was satisfied. And so on. And this is Patrick explaining how he got people to convert to Christianity in his confessions. So that's one perspective, one document, and that might be very much what you expect a religious adherent to say at that time period. So the confession is not too surprising. Now, in another writing, his other writing is, in my opinion, a little more interesting. It gives you a little more insight into Patrick's sort of struggle that he's facing in this Roman world. And he starts this one with the same sort of intro. "I'm Patrick. I'm a sinner and a very ignorant man. I declare that I've been appointed as bishop in Ireland, and I believe I have received this position from God himself." Now, this is a letter to the soldiers of Caroticus. Now, Caroticus was a warlord in Britain at the time. And Patrick writes about Caroticus, "As for Caroticus and his band of most evil criminals and rebels against Christ, where will they find themselves? They have distributed baptized Christian women as prizes, all for the sake of this fleeting world that will vanish in a moment. Like a cloud of smoke blown away by the wind, so these lying sinners will disappear from the sight of God. but the righteous will feast in the great happiness of Christ. They will judge the nations and rule over the wicked kings forever and ever. So in this one, he's really explaining his frustration at Caradocus, who was this warlord who goes over to Ireland and allegedly slaughters most of Patrick's converts. So we don't have a whole lot of information. Between those two letters, not a whole lot of information on Patrick. But from that has grown this amazing legend. And this is a quote from E.A. Thompson's book, Who Was St. Patrick? He writes, Father John Ryan, S.J., wrote, Patrick died in what was almost a blaze of glory and lived on in the popular memory as a great national figure, a worthy companion of heroes and kings. And E.A. Thompson responds to this, no doubt it ought to have been so, but as a matter of fact, nothing could be further from the truth. Not a single writer mentions him until the 7th century. And then he goes on to say that, this sort of thing happened where people would go over to Ireland, attempt to convert the pagans and die or come back or stay there and never return. So there's a lot of space for Patrick to be imagined. And part of that imagination happens in the 7th century when Ireland becomes more Christian. And Muirachú, an Irish bishop in the 7th century, writes a book called The Life of St. Patrick, and it's a hagiography. So it's writing laudatory things about St. Patrick, and it almost always follows the typical biblical story. And this is where you get a lot of the magical Patrick with his staff that can chase snakes away, and with the idea of the shamrock, the 3-leaf clover being used to teach the Trinity. So from these buildings, we have the growth of the myth of St. Patrick, and he sort of becomes this exceptional figure, and it really translates into the images and iconography that you might expect from Christianity. And if you look at a picture now of St. Patrick, you might see him holding a staff with snakes at his feet, driving the snakes away. And, the staff reminiscent of, say, Moses and Pharaoh, and his outfit with the long white beard and the halo.
I have not seen that, but that would be something that we could throw up on the episode notes, because I do want to check that out.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will also, there's some great public domain images that show sort of the progression of St. Patrick's image. And it reminds me of a funny story when Amy and I were in Serbia, and we got invited to have coffee with these Serbian Orthodox priests. And they were wonderful people, and they sang, and we had coffee. We enjoyed the dark, they called it Serbian coffee, but you might know it as Turkish coffee. And at one point, this priest starts describing God to us. And his description, he says, long white beard, golden robes. He was describing what a lot of the images of St. Patrick look like. So, all of that is just, that's part of the building of the character of St. Patrick. St. Patrick, in his 2 documents, never claims to drive any snakes away or use any shamrocks or convert the entire island. Really, all he just says he's a missionary. He says he's going to convert people, and he that's basically where he leaves it at. The rest is filled in later.
And I bet you're getting there, but maybe it's the beer lover in me. How does the beer into water tie into all this?
So it's kind of funny, but the same branch of bishops in the 7th century who are working from Ireland, creating this wonderful tradition of Irish saints, work not only on St. Patrick, but also on St. Brendan and St. Bridget. And the stories of St. Brendan and St. Bridget, really, they're very similar to the life of St. Patrick in that they follow a very typical biblical retelling. So one of the stories of the life of St. Bridget is where she turns water into beer. And this is the story. Another miracle performed by worthy Bridget was this. Lepers came asking for beer, although she had none to give. But seeing water prepared for baths, she blessed it, and with the power of faith, it turned into the finest beer. She then drew it out in abundance for thirsty lepers. So, yes, so you have all the classical tropes there, right?
Yeah, of all the magical powers, that's got to be up there on my list of ones that I want to get.
And clearly it's somehow I guess you could say it's, you know, Bridget did it there for the lepers, but St. Patrick has really done it for the Irish, as one can only guess or how much Guinness will be sold in 10 days. So you see this growth, and we're talking an enormous amount of time. And the way I always sort of explained it to my students when we were dealing with more ancient stuff, especially the younger students, is if Patrick's in the 5th century, you know, we can say century, but just think 100 years is a very long life. That's 15 very long lives ago that Patrick was living. So this is a very, very long time ago. Even the 7th century, when the first stories of these saints come out, it's an extremely long time ago. It's not until much later that Patrick becomes recognized as a, because the sainthood used to be just sort of a local thing, and it doesn't become, you know, institutionalized until much later. And it certainly becomes an Ireland type of point of pride. And then it folds itself into a whole web of complex, different routes history takes. So there's an enormous amount of threads that this story has that goes in almost as many ways or more ways than the Irish people themselves do. So, you know, St. Patrick and his story continues to be reproduced and relived and used for various purposes. And that's one of the reasons it's so important to study history, is because people take these symbols and they take these stories and then they use them for their purposes. So it's important for you to sort of be able to trace it and understand it. Take, for example, the flag of the United Kingdom. It features the cross of St. Patrick. So
is that right?
Part of having Ireland was a part of the United Kingdom, and Northern Ireland is still today, right? The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And the symbol at that time used for Ireland was the what we might say the red cross in the shape of an X over a white field. That's the St. Patrick's flag. So that's folded in addition to the cross of St. George, which is the red cross on a white field, and the cross of St. Andrew, which is the white X on the blue field. So these symbols are embedded. Say in the flag of Montreal, the Canadian city, in the bottom right corner is the shamrock, which is the 3-leafed clover. Yet when you go inevitably to these St. Patrick's Day marches, it's always the 4-leaf clover. And the luck of the Irish, blah, blah, blah. But the story with St. Patrick is that he used a shamrock, which is a three-leaf clover, which goes with the Trinity in the Christian story, or even the Roman story in the dog that guards hell. I'm not too up on Roman, so I'm sure we'll have.
So where did the four-leaf clover kind of start to take significance and come into play?
See, I don't know. That's a good question. I was looking at early postcards from early St. Patrick's Day celebrations, like, say, back in the 1900s, 1800s, and there's still shamrocks in those symbols. So, but, Glasgow Celtic football team, which founded in 1888, they used the four-leaf clover rather than the shamrock. So I don't know. That's a good question that a historian might ask and research.
Okay, and I just learned something new too. Is that a shamrock is three-leaf only? So a four-leaf clover wouldn't be a shamrock. Is that right?
That's correct. And we almost use them interchangeably in the United States, right?
Yeah, I see. It seems like it. That's kind of what I understood.
Right. So, but the four-leaf clover doesn't really go with the story, does it?
Nope, not really. With the Trinity and all that, you need the three.
Right. So, yeah. So you have changes, and that's part of why, why is St. Patrick's Day? It's a festival, right, where people wear green. But the original color of St. Patrick, St. Patrick's cross is red, yes, but the earliest association I've seen of him with a color is blue. And I don't know, I'm not sure why, but even Ireland, when it first gets its independence, or pseudo-independence, or almost independence, when it becomes the Irish Free State, its flag is blue with a harp on it. The color is blue. And even you can see remnants of that still today. The Northern Irish football team wears blue shirts or green shirts with blue trim. So when these things switch over and when green becomes the identity of St. Patrick's and Ireland, there's a certain point where all of this happens.
So it is definitely true, though, that the green being associated with St. Patrick has everything to do with that Ireland has green in its flag, and I'm probably venture to guess at some other parts of its symbolism.
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. It has to do more so with the Irish Republic's flag having green, and yeah. And the first St. Patrick's Day, now St. Patrick's Day was a religious holiday, that's for sure. It was a holy day of obligation in Ireland, where you would have to go to church on St. Patrick's Day. But in the United States, it became a cultural celebration. So even before there's a United States, back when it's still the colonies, there are St. Patrick's Day celebrations in Boston, in New York, and Philadelphia, and not necessarily parades. This is just Irish people getting together to A, have community, and B, celebrate something part of their community. So that's where you start, I think, to see a lot of changes in the imagery, the storytelling, the growth of the Irish identity abroad, and there are different growths and different changes and permutations with the Irish communities all over.
And yeah, I think with so many holidays in America, I kind of guess that it has to do a lot with our multiculturalism, is that they become very secular and very kind of we get tied up in the rituals that we perform every time the holiday comes around, and we kind of we lose a bit of the history. So it's, to kind of give kudos to you for choosing this topic. It's nice to get a little background on why we have these holidays.
Right, and it's really sort of remarkable how St. Patrick's Day has sort of seamlessly almost made that transition from a religious holiday to a secular holiday. I would hazard a guess that most, while the, say, New York Parade, it does still start at St. Patrick's Cathedral, I would hazard a guess that most marching in the parade aren't going to church. I mean, I have no data to back that claim up, but it's certainly those down in Lower Manhattan that are the Lower East Side are not celebrating it for religious reasons, from what I've seen.
This might be a good time to mention too that for any of our listeners, if you guys have anything to add to any of the stuff we're talking about, we'd love to learn from you too. So if you guys happen to have some, better depth of knowledge on any of these points that we're curious about, or that we're just kind of touching on but not going into, feel free to leave comments wherever you're listening to this podcast.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So yeah, we've talked sort of about what we know, the story of Patrick, and it's a great story, and there's resources all over that can kind of give you more depth on that story. We've talked a little bit about how we know it, a couple letters that Patrick left behind that have been translated and debated about, and historians have dedicated their entire life to analyzing those letters, and we just touched briefly on them. I gave you some short snippets to give you a taste. And then the last part always that we're trying to understand is what difference does it make? And we've talked a little bit about how this figure can be used for various people, how it still has a big cultural impact, and how it's sort of a spreading of culture. So it starts with Patrick spreading culture from Christian Roman Empire to the Druids in Ireland, and culture being spread back too. Of all signs of Patrick's story show that he wanted to go back to Ireland. That means that there must have been something there that was desirable for him. I highly doubt that his mission was to go back to a place that he didn't like at all, to convert people that he didn't like at all. Rather, I would think a concerned Patrick would be going back to Ireland to help convert these people that he grew fond of when he was over there, or at least grew concerned for. So you see these cross-cultural currents are just going back and forth, and they continue to do so as we prepare to celebrate or prepare to not celebrate. Even not celebrating is an act in its own on this cultural story that will continue to go based on the way you interact with it. And that's sort of why it's important to bring an understanding, and also why it's important to continue to question these things. So when you see Chicago turn its river green again this year, it's more meaningful to you. Or if it's not more meaningful to you, at least it's more interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely nice to get some context on what's going on during these holidays. Definitely cool.
Right, and then you also get the final thing, you sort of get an understanding of both the freedom and danger of using history the way you like. So, St. Patrick, he goes back to a time when there was not a united kingdom, right? It was the Roman Empire, and there was no Ireland at that time. Yet, as you go on, and as these national identities become more firmly ingrained in the individuals, St. Patrick becomes sort of both a ground that could be fought over and something that can unify people. In fact, the first immigrants to begin these St. Patrick's Day celebrations were Protestants. We're not even Catholics. In Boston, and dating back to the 1700s, it's much more likely, if not certain, that they were Protestants in the United States, and then so even that doesn't necessarily.
Yeah, I kind of want to ask.
Yeah.
I was kind of wondering. So, are there kind of non-Christian majority countries that celebrate St. Patrick's?
Well, that's a good question. It's a good historical question, and then you'd have to ask why. Why would they?
Yeah, well, I just kind of touching back on how secular it's gotten in America, and then I kind of wondered if from there it spread to other countries as a kind of secular holiday. The way that kind of Halloween has and Christmas has. I know here in Vietnam they celebrate Halloween kind of more and more every year, and probably most have little idea why, as many, maybe even Americans, myself to some degree included. But yeah, I know that after it becomes kind of secularized to some degree, it can easily spread just because of the fun of participating in it, and the little things you do, especially for the kids on these holidays, and for the kids and the adults,
right?
Especially on a holiday like St. Patty's.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I think that's a good question, and a good that could be a foundational study that you could do. Where is St. Patrick's Day celebrated? How is it celebrated, and why is it celebrated? You have 3 very rich questions from which you can begin to understand people who celebrate it as well.
Yeah, and then again, anyone who has something to add to that, feel free to comment.
Absolutely. So what I hope that the last 40 minutes did was give you a clearer understanding of how a historical figure can be taken, can leave just a little trace, and sort of be developed, grown, cherished in different ways, used in different ways, in almost endless permutations to create our present. So it's a windy road with multiple paths that leads us here, and hopefully I've elucidated some of that for St. Patrick and what happens on St. Patrick's Day, and maybe you can begin to think of this. We just had last month in the United States we had President's Day, and it's important to look back and attempt to understand these things.
Yeah, I think we got a good lot of information there to impress our friends at the bars on St. Patty's Day. So there's some good background, and then on top of that, it's just interesting stuff.
Yeah, and don't just tell them that information to impress them. You always want to cite your sources and give credit where credit's due. 2 sources I used on this one are The World of St. Patrick, written by Philip Freeman, put out by Oxford University Press just a year ago, and E.A. Thompson's Who Was St. Patrick? And that one's a little older, from 1999. And those are 2 very accessible works done by historians that attempt to answer these questions, and they do a fantastic job of doing it in less than 200 pages, and it's kind of fun to see how many people have tried to interpret it, and E.A. Thompson especially charts the different patrickologists well, and so anyway, long story short, when you're at the bar and you impress your friends, first impress them, then direct them over to the podcast, because coming up in the next foreseeable future, we're going to make this a regular thing, and I've got a lot of interesting topics coming up.
Yeah, how often are we doing this, and do you happen to know when they can tune back in to get the next episode?
So the goal is to get this coming out on a regular schedule. It's a lot of work to prepare this, but I want to have a strong catalog of a variety of topics. So my goal is to do it on a twice every other week, come out with a new episode. And the format is going to follow mostly because I teach, and this is also a good way to prepare for my lectures and for my discussions. I'm going to follow the classic world's history from second half of world history, so from 1500 on. And the way I want to do it, rather than take a question of just a topical recent relevance, I want to do that too. But what I really want to do with this show is take some documents, some historical documents from world history, introduce the document, contextualize the document, and then discuss the relevance, sort of what do we know, how do we know it, and why does it matter? And do that in a way to really, really begin to build some good foundational knowledge going forth. So starting in the 1500s, moving on, using primary source research primarily. So in a lot of ways, this introduction was an outlier, because besides the 2 letters, I was relying heavily on work other historians have done. My goal really is to give the sources and then sort of discuss them, unpack them a little bit from my perspective. Coming up immediately next episode is actually not going to be following that format. It's going to be another anomaly, both for James and I to get used to doing this new thing and to get your feedback and to open this to new audiences, but also to give me a chance to practice, because I'm presenting a paper at the Society for Latin America Studies conference in the first week in April, and I'm going to give that paper, or at least sections of or discussions from that paper, I'm going to give them a test online and open up that sort of conversation to the wider audience, so much as I am legally allowed to do so.
Good stuff. I know this this next podcast is going to be a little bit about one of your favorite topics. What would that be?
Yes, it is. It's going to be about something that I've really studied a lot, and something that I'm pulling almost all from primary source research that has not really been talked about. Right now I'm working on a project that that's going to be the theme of the next episode. It's going to be about the Quakers, the Quaker Relief Organization, the American Friends Service Committee, who in 1939 worked together with the American Joint Jewish Distribution Committee in order to set up a refugee camp for people fleeing from Central Europe, Jewish refugees from Central Europe, and they set up the camp actually in just outside of Havana, Cuba, as sort of this interesting in-between spot while people were not allowed to come to the U.S. because a lot of these refugees had to apply under existing quota systems. So if too many Germans were coming to the United States, then the United States would say, it doesn't really matter what's happening in Germany. You're over the quota, so you can't come to our country. So these, and a lot of the times these were, without giving away too much, some of the middle class or higher Jews in Germany. So they would pay for passage to Cuba, and it would be sort of like this unofficial existence where they weren't under any illusions of becoming Cuban nationals, but wanted to get to America eventually and were going to find a way. So it's a very interesting story with a lot of cross-cultural interactions, a lot of interfaith interactions, and just some extraordinary Quakers who had taken some flack for not fighting in World War I, and out of that developed an enormous humanitarian tradition that actually continues to today.
Good stuff. Sounds like we got some interesting stuff coming up.
Excellent. Yes, I'm very excited.
Alrighty. Well, it looks like we've got enough to chew on today, I think.
Great. So I guess that makes an hour of history. So wherever you are on March 17th this year, whether it's a church or a bar or next to a creepy green river in Chicago, think about St. Patrick and think about the history and think about the world around you and find some questions to ask, because that's what we do as historians, and that's what we do here on the Hour of History. And now, as a special presentation, I'd like to offer about 10 minutes of me just messing around on my fiddle when I was testing out my mic for the new podcast. These are just basic riffs from O'Neill's Music of Ireland, a famous fiddler from Chicago who compiled almost 2,000 melodies into one book. These are just songs that he had picked up over at the pub during sessions. So I'm just incorporating them. I'm just messing around, not really playing anything formally. So enjoy.